what if Henry Cavill returned for Man of Steel 2? For starters, allegedly it wouldn't have been called that. Instead, rumors suggest that it would have been titled Man of Tomorrow, and it would have been a direct sequel to Man of Steel, as Henry Cavill would go on to say that he didn't consider Batman vs. Superman a Man of Steel sequel, viewing it instead as an introduction to the Justice League.
It is very much in my desire to do a Man of Steel 2, a direct sequel to Man of Steel.
Sure.
And there's a whole bunch of Superman story that I want to tell. There's a whole style of Superman's character that I'm very keen to tell.
And while that film would come very close to happening several times, it ultimately would get canceled. So let's dive in and find out why that happened and what could have been Man of Tomorrow. While writer David Goyer and Christopher Nolan were writing the story for The Dark Knight Rises, they got stuck on the third act and decided to take a break. When they regrouped, Nolan asked Goyer if he had cracked the script, to which Goyer replied no, leading Nolan to ask,
"What the hell have you been doing?" I said, "I don't know, I've been screwing around with the Superman idea." And he said, "Well, let's hear it." I told it to him, and he said, "I would produce that if you want."
Goyer's idea was to treat it more like a First Contact story and show what it would actually be like if a godlike alien arrived on Earth. And while they would eventually hire Zack Snyder to direct the picture, they also considered Tony Scott as well.
Chris had also met with Tony Scott. So there's a version of a Tony Scott Man of Steel in some parallel universe. That's just a movie I would have also loved to have seen.
When Man of Steel came out, it received a mixed to positive reception, and while it was a success, it wasn't the critical darling that Batman Begins was. Still, plans moved ahead for a sequel, and with the brief appearance of a Wayne Enterprises satellite during Superman's fight with Zod, many fans began to wonder if DC was following Marvel's path of producing a handful of standalone films to introduce each hero before teaming everyone up in an Avengers-style film. As the team sat down to discuss what the sequel to Man of Steel should be about and who the villain should be, Zack Snyder immediately suggested Batman, feeling it would be an interesting contrast to go from Superman fighting his physical equal from his home planet to fighting a man from Earth with no superpowers at all. Plus, Snyder didn't want to do another alien invasion movie. While Snyder and Nolan considered having Man of Steel take place in Nolan's Dark Knight universe, they ultimately decided against it, given that The Dark Knight Rises ends with Bruce Wayne retiring and John Blake taking over as Batman. Furthermore, they felt that audiences would be disappointed seeing Joseph Gordon-Levitt's Batman slug it out with Superman instead of Christian Bale's. As a result, they decided to recast and create an entirely new Batman to fit into this universe. It's also important to put this in historical context. Man of Steel came out 1 year after the Avengers, so Warner Brothers, eager to catch up and have a billion-dollar grossing team-up film of their own, decided to forego doing standalone films for each character and instead rushed out a Justice League film following Batman v Superman.
The person that was running Brothers at the time had done this big release where they had pitched like these 20 movies over the next 10 years that like none of which were written yet. And like, it was just so crazy how much sort of architecture was just being built, on air. And for me, that some of the stuff that was going on in that time was just an example of like, this is not how you build a house.
Because of this short-sightedness, Man of Steel, BVS, and Justice League would all underperform, leading to Man of Steel 2 being constantly put off in favor of producing other DC properties, as Warner Brothers scrambled to catch up to Marvel. And while Zack Snyder famously left the production of Justice League before it was finished, had he stayed on and returned to direct Man of Steel 2, or at least overseen its development, he would have looked to other worlds for Superman's villain for the film.
I think you really have to look outside of the Earth for challenges for him because of how powerful he is.
And the villain he would have featured was Brainiac. And while Brainiac has appeared on shows like Smallville and Krypton, his big screen debut has been long overdue. Although there were plans to feature him as the main villain in both Superman 3 and Tim Burton's infamously scrapped Superman Lives, where the character would have been played by Christopher Walken. Henry Cavill was also keen to feature him too.
I think a great villain would be Brainiac. I think that'd be a good villain to play against.
Still, Superman's primary antagonist would have continued to be Lex Luthor.
And of course, you'd have to continue with Lex because Lex is his real nemesis.
And because of that, rumors suggested that Lex would have played a role in Brainiac's origin, with Lex using Kryptonian tech to enhance Lex OS, resulting in the creation of Brainiac. This would have been similar to not only how Doomsday was created in BVS, but also would share some similarities to the creation of Ultron. Snyder was also interested in bringing back the Kryptonians stuck in the Phantom Zone.
The Kryptonians that are in the Phantom Zone are probably still around. There was always a possibility for their return.
However, it's important to note that several different pitches and treatments were submitted by various writers and directors between the time BVS came out to when the project was finally scrapped. And it's rumored that David Goyer's pitch would have built off the Man of Steel prequel comic he wrote with Zack Snyder and a few others that takes place on Krypton thousands of years ago. In it, we meet Kara Zor-El, who eventually will become Supergirl, and watch as she nears completion of her training to become a member of Krypton's Explorers Guild. Citizens tasked was searching the cosmos for suitable planets to terraform and make them inhabitable for Kryptonians. Kara's journey to colonize other planets takes an unexpected turn though, leading to a confrontation that ultimately brings her to prehistoric Canada as her ship crash lands in the snow, eventually getting buried underneath the ice sheet, with her going into a deep freeze like a certain Captain Rogers. The comic ends in 2013 as a signal is discovered by NASA deep underground in Canada. Elsewhere at this time, Clark Kent is working on a fishing boat off the Alaskan coast. In Man of Steel 2, Supergirl would have been awakened before Brainiac comes to Earth looking for the Codex, and from the bits of Kryptonian knowledge Brainiac has, creates Bizarro, who he sends after Supergirl and Superman to retrieve the Codex. Matthew Vaughn, director of X-Men First Class and Kingsman, was reportedly Warner Brothers' top choice to direct, and the feeling was apparently mutual, as Vaughn has said that he was desperate to direct a Superman movie, even pitching his own take before Goyer and Nolan pitch what would become Man of Steel. However, Vaughn would state that he felt it was a mistake to pair up Superman and Batman right after Man of Steel, feeling that the two characters and universes they exist in don't gel well together. He would go on to say that he thinks there's room for a new Superman film, but a proper Superman film, one that's colorful and fun and not a dark one. Henry Cavill would echo these sentiments.
I would love to draw from all of my favorite comic books and have that joyful, hopeful, powerful figure who Superman is.
Unfortunately, following the disappointing Batman v Superman and the absolute disaster that was Justice League, Warner Brothers pumped the brakes on Man of Steel 2 as they rethought their approach to DC's film slate. Director Christopher McQuarrie, who had just worked with Henry Cavill on Mission Impossible Fallout, would team up with the actor to pitch their take on a brighter, more fun Man of Steel 2.
And not just like the chocolate box sort of, saving kittens and stuff. A little bit of that, absolutely, but also the badass version of Superman. Superman who you see his raw power, not necessarily unleashed in a negative way, but you see it in the protection of other people.
But Warner Brothers chose not to pursue the idea. Ironically, and what would become a sign of things to come, later that year when Warner Brothers was courting James Gunn, the filmmaker behind Guardians of the Galaxy, the studio offered him the chance to write and direct Man of Steel 2, but he chose to reboot the Suicide Squad instead. While the studio negotiated with Cavill to reprise his role for a brief cameo in Shazam, contract talks between the two sides broke down, which is why we never see Superman's face in the film, which frankly was embarrassing for DC, considering all the cameos of Marvel characters between each of their films. Unable to come to agreement with Cavill, and with Warner Brothers recognizing that none of Cavill's films performed up to expectations at the box office, they considered hitting the reset button on both Superman and the DC Universe. However, before that could happen, there would be one final attempt to bring back Cavill for a long-delayed Man of Steel sequel. Ever since Dwayne Johnson made the leap from pro wrestler to actor, he's been linked to playing Black Adam, Shazam's arch nemesis. A script for Shazam would finally be written in 2017, which would have featured Black Adam as the film's villain. Except there was just one problem. When Dwayne Johnson was first linked to the role in the early 2000s, he was a wrestler turned actor trying to make a name for himself in Hollywood. But by 2017, he was the biggest movie star on the planet, and felt that appearing in Shazam as the villain behind a largely unknown Zachary Levi did not align with his status as a top-tier star, and also overlooked the potential of transforming the character of Black Adam Adam into a multi-film franchise of its own. Instead, Johnson suggested separating the characters and giving them each their own films. Not only that, but Johnson had his eyes on a much bigger matchup. Johnson had his eyes on Superman and felt those two squaring off against each other would do huge business. So with that in mind, Johnson pitched a multi-year plan for Black Adam and a Cavill-led Superman in which the two properties would interweave, setting up an eventual Superman vs. Black Adam showdown worthy of a WrestleMania main event.
The hierarchy of power in the DC universe is about to change.
This is also a good time to point out that both Johnson and Cavill had the same manager, Johnson's ex-wife, Dani Garcia. And Johnson and Garcia were relentless in not only convincing Cavill to return to the role, but Warner Brothers as well, who were reluctant to sign on. But eventually they did and paid Cavill $250,000 to appear at the end of Black Adam in a cameo that was shot very late in production, which saw Cavill don the original Superman suit from Man of Steel. At this stage, Cavill even left his role on The Witcher, with some speculating it was to focus on playing Superman again, although there were also reports of creative differences.
I wanted to make it official that I am back as Superman.
Unfortunately, two very important things happened next. First, Black Adam would bomb relative to its budget and receive mostly negative reviews. And two, James Gunn would be hired by Warner Brothers in a Kevin Feige-like role to run DC.
Is James Gunn the Kevin Feige of DC?
Peter Safran does a lot of what Kevin Feige does. A lot of what I do is I just work on the creative side of things.
And his first order of business would be to finish all of the DC films currently in production, such as Shazam 2, The Flash, Blue Beetle, and Aquaman 2, before rebooting the entire DCU and starting fresh. Just prior to Gunn assuming control of DC, a script treatment for Man of Steel 2 was written by Stephen Knight, creator of Peaky Blinders, that again would have featured Brainiac. However, both Warner Brothers and James Gunn reportedly were underwhelmed by it. And with that, Gunn would go on to start fresh, prioritizing a rebooted Superman film that he would write and direct himself, featuring a younger Superman.
Next up is the big one, the true beginning of the DCU. This is called Superman Legacy.
Cavill, who filmed another cameo for The Flash, would have that cameo cut by Gunn, who decided it wasn't wise to tease future DC films that fans were never going to see, making Cavill's cameo in Black Adam the last we would see of his Superman.
Henry Cavill is the Superman of our generation, and he is a phenomenal Superman.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Bullets and Blockbusters for more great content.